Is Nouriel Roubini. He's a professor of economics at NYU Stern. And Nouriel, I have joked with you in the past, the nickname that some on Wall Street have called you, Dr. Doom, because you do warn people about things that are right in front of our faces. So I'm going to ask you this question. Do you see silver linings? What do you see that might be optimistic looking forward economically as we confront this growing crisis?
Well, for now, there is not much to be optimistic. What we can hope is that if there's going to be the right fiscal stimulus, that has to be something of at least 3% of GDP, this is going to be a very severe but short recession, meaning the recession already starting in this quarter, given the data on retail sales that came out today. So we'll have a Q1 contraction, a Q2 contraction, most likely a Q3 contraction. But if we have the monetary easy we have right now, if we control the pandemics by doing really systematic quarantines, maybe by June, July, the pandemic is stopped. And maybe by the fourth quarter of this year, we have an economic recovery. So this is going to be more severe than the global financial crisis because it's front-loaded. It didn't take a year and a half for having the collapse of output. It didn't take us to get to Lehman. Lehman got into 1 month rather than in 18 months. And it could be shorter, 3 quarters rather than 6, 7, but it's going to be very severe. But the key thing is that we need the fiscal stimulus. You know, the Fed has done everything under the sun. They'll do more, including today the commercial paper facility. But unless you have something to backstop private demand that is collapsing, exports are collapsing, consumption is collapsing, residential investment is collapsing, capex is collapsing, everything is collapsing in the private sector. So you need to have the one agent in the economy that has the balance sheet that can either spend more and or transfer income to those who need it. I've been among the first one to propose $1,000 to every single U.S. resident. Doesn't matter whether you're young or old, employed, unemployed, student, formally employed, partially employed, hourly worker, contractor, gig, small business. Everybody needs at least $1,000. Otherwise, we're going to end up like in the Great Depression at this point.
Nouriel, it's Julia LaRoche. Thank you so much for joining us. I was going to ask you about the Fed's move today and if you thought that might be somewhat helpful, especially given the stress that we have been seeing in the debt markets. What do you make of it?
Well, it's useful because large firms that are investment grade, that even the investment grade firms now cannot issue commercial paper, let alone those that are not investment grade. That's going to help those highly graded firm. The reality is, however, is that the credit market has completely shut down. There's no issuance of CLOs, of leverage loans, of high yield, of high grade, and we have trillions of dollars of fallen angels, of junk bonds that have been issued with covenant light and other types of junk of that sort. And we're going to have a debt crisis. We have had a spike today in the last month of high yield spreads from 300 to 800. It took 1 month. In 2015 and 16, it took 7 months between August of 15 and February of 16 for having the same kind of spike. That spike has occurred in 1 month. This is something we didn't even see during the global financial crisis. This is not a problem with the stock market falling 30%. Yes, there will be a wealth effect. The problem is in credit market. We're on the verge of a debt crisis. And while there'll be programs to provide credit to those firms and individuals that are illiquid but solvent, the reality is that in the economy, there has been so much issuance of debt in the last few years, corporate debt especially, that many companies are going to go bankrupt regardless of. This is going to be a debt crisis. It's not just a liquidity crisis.
So, Nouriel, if that's the case, what do you make of this announcement that the Fed just made in terms of restarting the commercial paper facility? If that is one of the areas of most acute stress, does it make sense for them to do that? And how much is that going to mitigate what's going on?
Listen, if you are a AAA or AA or single A company issuing commercial paper, now you can have access to that facility. But if you are that $1 trillion of fallen angels that are BBB minus, you don't have access to this facility. If you're among those firms that have issued something like $8 trillion of junk bonds that is not investment grade, you don't have access to that facility. if you are any one of dozens of millions of small and medium-sized businesses and firms that do not even have access to the bond market, let alone to the corporate paper market, you're not going to be able to have access to this facility. You have essentially the very top of the US corporates, those that actually have cash, those that are AAA, AA, and single A, today cannot issue commercial paper, and we're going to help them. Everybody else, that is 95% of corporate America and businesses, small, medium-sized, and even larger, do not have access to this facility. So is it helpful? Yes. It's helpful to the Boeings of the world, to the Ford of the world, to those kind of firms. It's not going to be available to anybody else. Nobody else, meaning 95% of corporate America and of firms of businesses do not have access to this facility and will not have access to this facility. So let's not exaggerate the importance of this small facility that is small in size and limited to very, very few firms that are highly, highly graded.
Nouriel, I want to go back to the stress that we are seeing in the debt markets. Just want to get your take on this, because last year and the year before, we were often talking about just record numbers of stock buybacks, of share repurchases. How much do you think that factors into all of this?
Well, there has been a massive increase in the last decade of corporate debt. Corporate debt as a share of GDP, as a share of corporate income, as a share of any measure of ability to pay, has exploded. It's an all-time high. And part of it was, of course, firms borrowing to invest into capital spending. But we know that in the last few years, there's been a massive increase in share buybacks. Some of those share buybacks have been occurring by using the cash that really profitable firms had, but also less profitable firms, that were those that were junk firms, have issued a huge amount of debt to do share buybacks. This was financial engineering that was boosting artificially earnings per share, that was boosting artificially the value of these firms in the stock market, but was making these firms even more leveraged than they were before. So it was a crazy, dangerous, and I would say reckless form of financial engineering. And therefore, those firms that were already highly leveraged, that use share buybacks financed with debt, including many of the activities that are occurring in private equity, are going to be now under severe stress. They were highly leveraged before. They're more leveraged now because of what they did.
So, Nouriel, I am curious. I just want to point out, you mentioned the $1,000, and I quoted you. I tweeted your quote out to everybody on Twitter that the Congress needs to send $1,000 to everybody regardless as soon as possible. Facebook is giving its employees $1,000. They've just announced that. But as Congress is now debating a stimulus package, at the top of this discussion with you, and we should point out you're going to be with us for several more minutes, another 20 minutes, even if we go to break. You mentioned that any stimulus package, fiscal package, needs to be 3% of GDP. So we're talking minimum $600 billion. Accurate? They're talking possibly $1 trillion. How quickly can the Congress get that money to stimulate the economy so that we see positive results?
Well, first of all, I fear that doing even a $200 billion fiscal package is going to take us time. They've been discussing the Pelosi bill in the House for over a week now, and that's only $50 billion. And that has not even been passed because the Republicans and the Senate are dragging their feet on permanent paid sick leave or things of that sort, right? So we're at $50 billion. And then they're talking now about 800. We're not going to reach 800 until the stock market is down 40 or 50%. And then once the market has crashed, once the economy is crashed, we're going to get there. Think about it. During the global financial crisis, it was only after Lehman, a year and a half after the crisis started, that we did the bailout of the banks. And it was only after Obama came to power, essentially April of 2009, when we had the joint G20 London conference that led us to a massive coordinated global fiscal stimulus. The reality is that we're in an election year. What the Democrats want and what the Republicans want is completely different. We need at least $600 billion, possibly $800 billion, plus liquidity support and other things that the Fed can do. But we're not going to get there, in my view, for another 2 or 3 months, because we're going to start with 50, then 100, then 200. And once then everything is imploding, once the GDP number for the first quarter are going to show us a free fall, once we're going to have a stock market falling not 30%, but 40 or 50, maybe At that point, the markets are going to force the hands of the politician in Congress, and we're going to get the fiscal stimulus, but it's going to be too late. And also our health response is too little, too late. Today, in terms of the number of the contagion, we look exactly like Italy 2 weeks ago. And we're not doing even the kind of things that Italy is doing. Italy has full quarantine. Everybody, everywhere in the country, 60 million people are locked up at home. We're still in a situation in which anybody can go anywhere. We have to do what Italy has done. We should have done it 2 weeks ago. Therefore, the contagion in the United States is going to be much worse than in Italy. Mark my word. 2 weeks from now, we can discuss it. It's going to be much worse than Italy. So we're not dealing with the health crisis, and we're not dealing with the economic crisis. We're not dealing with the debt crisis, and we're not doing the fiscal stuff. The fiscal stuff should have been passed by Congress 2 weeks ago. It's going to take us another 2 months until we get to 3% of GDP. It's not going to happen before, unfortunately.
Nouriel, I want to get back to this $1,000 for every citizen in the United States that you talked about. And we've already gotten a response on Twitter from somebody who says, what good would that do? So can you answer that question? What good would sending each of us $1,000 do? And then the second part of it would be, is this a universal basic income argument? And should we be looking at perhaps maybe long-term continuing that?
Well, we need it because right now, what's happening is that lots of people are losing jobs, especially those who don't have a formal employment. I mean, if you're formally employed, you cut the payroll tax, your health, but there are dozens of millions of people that are informally employed, partially employed, there are gig workers, contractor, hourly, retired, student, children, and so on and so on. If you offer $1,000 to every single American, first of all, it's highly progressive. If I make only $10,000 a year, it's 10% of my income. If I make $100,000, it's only 1% of my income. Secondly, if I'm a household of four, husband, wife, 2 children, I get $4,000 also for my children. And you cannot do something only targeted. Yes, we'll do targeted help to those who are sick, to those who are unemployed, to those that have trouble. But we have also provide money to everybody because we have no idea who is the gig worker that worked for a restaurant or for a hotel or for any service that right now has zero income. So we have to use $1,000 for everybody. Just transfer it to their bank account, to their checking account, to their Venmo, to PayPal, whatever not. And you provide immediately income for people that don't have any. Today, 40% of American households, based on the Fed number, have less than $400 of liquid cash to deal with emergency. 40% of households, less than $400. These people are not going to have even money to buy food once they lose their jobs. So you have to do something emergency. You cannot just try to do something exactly targeted. It's going to take us months to figure out who is supposed to be getting what and so on. You do something across the board for everybody, is progressive. You could maybe exclude the top 10% of the population that is rich, but it doesn't matter. If you exclude the top 10%, you save yourself only $35 billion out of 350. And 350 is only 1.5% of GDP. I'm expecting a stimulus that has to be more like 3% of GDP, closer to 600-700 billion. And then you're using the target, the support, the need for the targeted one. So you do both across the board and targeted. Is this universal basic income? Not really, because it's temporary. The idea of universal basic income, you give everybody something every month for all their lives. This is too expensive. Right. Even for 1 month, it's going to cost us $350 billion. If it was done for a year, it would cost us $3.5 trillion. Of course, we cannot afford it. But we can do it on a temporary basis because right now there is a severe economic crisis driven by a totally exogenous shock. If and whether in the future we deserve, we need, and we can afford a universal basic income is another story for when we're going to get out of this financial crisis. But that's separately. This is temporary. UBI instead is permanent.
So I want to mention 2 headlines that I saw this morning. One was from a Marist poll that said about 18% of Americans, and this survey was done in the last couple of weeks, about 18% of Americans say they have already had their hours reduced or been let go because of coronavirus. And then there was another headline that apparently The Information, which is a tech news source, said that Facebook is planning $1,000 bonuses to help employees during this crisis. So what those headlines say to me is that if we don't have a plan like you're discussing, and as you painted earlier, the likelihood of us actually getting that until it's too late is pretty high, that we're not going to get it until it's too late. What kind of income inequality increase are we going to see as a result of this virus?
Well, if we don't do it, we literally going to have riots in the streets and people going to the supermarket and literally taking over everything and stealing it because people are going to start starving. There are tons of people I know in New York, everybody that is in hotel business or in a restaurant or in a bar or in the gig economy, they tell me they have no income. Their income has collapsed to zero. And as I said, almost half of Americans have less than $400 of liquid cash to deal with an emergency, $400. So either you give $1,000 and that's not even sufficient, you're going to have to do more targeted for the people who deserve it. But if you don't start with $1,000, you're going to have riots in the streets and people going and taking over every store. We're going to have violence in the street in the next few weeks. That's what's going to happen.
Wow. Nouriel, it's Julia again. It's certainly a dire picture. And again, like the likelihood of the $1,000 going through, if that doesn't happen, the consequences, as you just highlighted there, and answering Julie's question, are severe. I guess my question is, what role can even the private sector play to help mitigate some of these? What do you think they can do?
Well, the Facebooks of the world can keep their employees on payroll at full pay, even if they don't work or they work from home. They can give them $1,000. So if you're the top 5% of corporate America, highly profitable, highly rich, highly cash full, you can help them. You can even afford having a collapse of your revenue for 3 months and paying everybody. But if you are any other firm that is medium size or smaller size that has a collapse of your revenues of, say, 50%, let alone more, you have a dilemma. If you pay the workers in full, you're going to go bankrupt. And if you don't pay them and you furlough them and they don't get this support from the government, if you don't have unemployment insurance, and most people are not formally employed, and therefore they're not going to qualify for unemployment insurance, then you're going to have people literally starving. So you have a hit to the income. Either the hit is taken by the workers, in which case they starve, or is taken by the firms that pay them full salary and they don't work, in which case the firms go bankrupt, or you share the pain. How do you do the risk sharing? The worker doesn't get full pay. Maybe they get 70% of pay. Some of it, the rest of it is paid by the firm, and some of it is paid by the government. So you do a risk sharing between the firm, the worker, and the government. That's how you absorb the shock so that neither the worker, nor the firm, nor the government goes bankrupt. That's what you need to do.
Nouriel Roubini, a professor of economics at NYU Stern. We appreciate your insight here on The Move.
Good talking with you today.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.